We're talking about a topic that's really close to all of us across the country, but especially here in South Florida. We're talking a little bit about the opioid epidemic.
If we look at kind of how this all started, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, started a crackdown on a number of pill mills here in South Florida and throughout the state of Florida. What she found was that, in fact, you had doctors who were selling prescription drugs. That was, in the South Florida sense, really one of the events that brought forward the idea of the opioid crisis into the public space.
Isn't it crazy to think about the fact, and I've talked a lot about this too with opioids, and that these are products that are equivalent to heroin.
Yeah.
We have big pharmaceutical companies that push these drugs as non-addictive.
Yeah.
And indeed, these substances are just like a lot of these street-level substances.
Well, in fact, they are. And the pharmaceutical company has, in my view, a lot of the blame to take for pushing these drugs because they are so addictive. What ends up happening at one of the urgent care centers that I own here in South Florida, we see people coming in all the time who are addicted to prescription drugs.
You know, I read a statistic somewhere that out of every person who's addicted, there are 5 family members that are profoundly impacted by that addiction.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that statistic is absolutely right, because it is, not only the person, but their entire network, their entire way of being that's affected by that. Someone ends up having to pay for that. And so society, in some form or the other, has to pay for it, while the pharmaceutical companies walk away with their tidy profits. That's a large part of the problem. The whole idea with opioids is that it is designed to treat pain. There are topical solutions that are available and non-addictive. Insurance companies will not pay for those topical solutions.
Well, they've been pushing drugs for profits the same way the pill mills
Absolutely.
were pushing drugs for profits. And
Same
that's
thing.
why we've created the situation that we're now in. But now that we're in that situation, we now have this larger piece to treat that I know you know a lot about,
Yes.
which is our actual communities, to heal our communities. What do we do?
Well, from the standpoint of the communities, first of all, we have to look at addiction as what it is, which is a disease and not a reason to shun people. 2, treatment programs should be designed to treat the entire person, both from the medical standpoint and from the psychological and mental standpoint. Number 3, we have to do follow-up testing with the people who have gone through addiction. Now, in South Florida, what we have is this culture in which there are so-called treatment centers. The problem with a number of the treatment centers is there is no treatment. They come in, they pay an exorbitant amount of money, they go out, and they're out for a couple days, a couple weeks, and they're back.
Well, and you could talk about the buzzword on this thing is sober homes.
Yes.
And the buzzword, Pam Bondi, and especially for me in Palm Beach County with Dave Arenberg, they've really been at the forefront of this crisis. And there's not a lot of regulations when it comes to these sober homes, and they fall under the ADA.
Yes.
So therefore, it's very hard to enact laws to prevent this from happening.
Right. That's something that's blending into the culture, because in fact, we do need legislation to regulate those sober homes. And ACA, which is the overall licensing organization, state agency, here's the problem. The problem with ACA is that ACA staff need to be trained and understand what is actually going on. This is an area in which legislation is extremely important, and in which people start getting fined for operating these so-called sober homes because they're not sober homes. In fact, what ends up happening is people leave there even more addicted than they were once they came in, because there's no real exceptional screening process to take people in.
You've also got these treatment centers, a very fine line. They're also prescribing some of the same drugs that these people are addicted to when you look at Suboxone or some of these other things. So these things are capable of treating it to a certain degree, but if they're not regulated properly, you end up with somebody who's an addict who's now addicted to another drug.
Well, and with Suboxone, for example, in some cases, what they will do is they will do this tapering. So essentially, they get you on a little, and then it goes up and up and up and up, and that simply doesn't work.
But as our South Florida community also explores this other topic on medical marijuana, I think it opens up a very interesting dialogue because a lot of people don't know what the difference is. They just think of them both classified as drugs.
Yeah, and they're not.
And they're not, and they're very different things.
Yeah, they're very different things because the whole problem with opioids is that it is addictive. That's a huge distinction. We don't know from the research that's been done so far that anyone's been addicted to medical marijuana.
What advice can you give our viewers? How can you tell if you have a friend or a family member or somebody who's affected by this type of addiction?
So there are a couple of things to look at. Do you have someone who is supposedly working at a job, but never has any money? They never get a paycheck. That's one of the things that you would want to look at. How often is this person kind of binging, if you will? They disappear, they don't do the things that they've been doing.
Do you see some positive strides being made though?
Yeah, I do think there are positive strides being made. If we go back to what you talked to about the president and the administration, the opioid panel has put together some very strong recommendations. And I think there's also a growing awareness. It's not going fast enough, but there is a growing awareness now as to what needs to be done. So I'm very optimistic about that.
For sure. Well, I look forward to having a more positive follow-up at some time in the future. And I guess we'll just have to stay tuned and watch what the administration does. And stay tuned to Eye on South Florida and stay tuned with Dr. Metzler to find out more about the opioid epidemic and the positive strides being made.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.